Hello, everybody. My name is Frank Sliges, Professor of Landscape Architecture, and welcome to the Zube lecture today. We've been very successful recent weeks and great attendance, and today we're excited too. And I want to thank people behind the scenes, Stacy, Nathan, and the Zube lecture. Was named after Irv Zube, who left an endowment for the department to bring in world-class speakers and practitioners, academians, and to share their views and to engage in the discussion. So we have a special event on April 22nd, and it's the LARP GDA committee. And we wanted to give students a room to speak at Zube, and you see that in the chat. So we're still looking for students, recruit students to lead this lecture, April 22nd. I will probably also add Michael DePasquale's email here. So, or somebody else doing it, but
so throw it to me or Michael.
Yeah.
If they don't get the tiny URL, we'll have Terry send out the notice again sometime next week.
Yeah, so it's a great opportunity for you guys to engage and fill up the space and well, discuss things that are happening. And thank you. And I'm handing it over to Daryl, who will announce the next week and also our guest today.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Daryl Ramsey Musoff. I'm in the regional planning portion, and I teach land use and housing, as well as race, gender, sexuality, and global cities. It is my deepest pleasure and honor to bring to us Dr. April Jackson. Now, here's the part where I'm going to be official. All right. April is, and here's where her ears are going to burn because I'm talking about her, but in a good way. An assistant professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida State University. Her research focuses on the way planners can promote racial equity and inclusion in mixed income communities, institutions, workplaces, and advocating for equitable, inclusive, and just communities. Her current research explores how Choice Neighborhood Initiatives, which is a HUD program, facilitates racial equity in implementation of the built environment and community building practices in Chicago, Illinois. Chicago is where April also got her PhD at U of I, Chicago. Never been there, but I'm here. It's a Bauman school. April's working on 2 projects that examine how urban planning programs, institutions, and workplaces, and it's funny that you should say workplaces because one of her recent papers came out is about racial equity and planners of color, but I'll let her talk about that. Can work towards creating more inclusive places that value and promote diversity in partnership with the American Planning Association and the Association of Colleges and Schools of Planning, with the Planners of Color Interest Group, which I'm a member of. Prior to her faculty position, she worked as an architect and urban designer at DeStefano Partners and AECOM in Chicago and Irvine, California on public housing redevelopment projects, neighborhood revitalization plans, and new urbanist communities in China, US, and the Middle East. So right now, I'm gonna read the titles of her research, and you're gonna get the real flavor of April. Gown to Town, negotiating mutually beneficial relationships between colleges, students, city planners, and a historically marginalized African-American neighborhood. Like a fish out of water, the experience of African-American and Latinx planning students. Beyond recruitment, comparing experiences of climate and diversity between international students and domestic students of color in the US urban planning programs. My favorite, tiny homes as an inadequate solution to ameliorate homelessness. A case study in the dwellings in Tallahassee, Florida. cultural competence and racial inclusion in new urbanist communities, which was a chapter in a book. And lastly, accountability matters. Beyond commitment, the role of accountability mechanism in implementing plans and mixed income communities. And lastly, Dr. Jackson has won this Boomin' Ass Award. Oops, that's being recorded. Anyway, from the McKnight Foundation, which has paid for her to take a sabbatical to concentrate on the research, which is important to her, which will then become important to all of us. With that, can I get some snaps for April Jackson?
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Daryl. And thanks again for inviting me to present. Really excited to be here. I come from you by way of Chicago, where I'm currently conducting research with the preservation of affordable housing in collaboration with the National Initiative on Mixed Income Communities. But my home is at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, is everyone able to see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to be sharing some work that was done in partnership with the American Planning Association and the ACSP Planner of Color Interest Group, as Daryl mentioned, and talk about addressing challenges of diversity, representation, bias, and discrimination in planning practice. And much of this work comes out of our most recent JAPA publication that's entitled Feeling Like an Odd Duck, African American and Latinx perspectives in planning practice. So I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in this work, Evis Garcia, Andrew Greenlee, Benjamin Krissinger, Ajin Lee, and Anaid Urena. And this work was partially funded by ACSP. Okay, let me get the hang of it here. So I'm going to give a sort of brief overview and discuss our study context. I'll touch on our research methods and then really kind of drill down into the findings of our work and then offer some recommendations for the future. So, we're currently, right, sort of in this space of a global racial reckoning, right, in the midst of a pandemic. And as I watch, right, sort of the Derek Chauvin trial every day, it's sort of brought back, everything that's happened in 2020, right, during the spring and summer 2020 nationwide anti-racism protest due to the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks, among many others, right, in police custody. And this has brought sort of renewed attention, right, to the issues of police brutality against African Americans and Latinos, and the rise of anti-Asian violence, right? And also, people are now sort of having more public consciousness around racial and income inequality and the growing wealth divide, right? COVID has certainly exacerbated the health disparities here in the United States. Now there's more attention on environmental racism and housing discrimination. We saw last year many statements come out from corporations and private institutes, right, particularly universities. And now public and private investment in equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives are on the rise. We're seeing anti-racism and decolonial research being done, new anti-racism centers, and also policy directives from the Biden administration on racial equity, right? Particularly the Voting Rights Act, which is going to be critical to deal with the legislation recently passed in Georgia. So there's been, a renewed commitment to racial justice. And while this is a unique moment in history of racial reckoning, I think it's really imperative that planners use this, right, as an opportunity to really be proactive in valuing diversity now more than ever. So as planners, I think we understand the importance of diversity, but we're working within these very polarized political and social environments, right? I think requires an even higher and stronger response from higher education and professional planners. Right, as planners, we're working with community stakeholders to develop plans at the local, county, and regional level with the goal to really promote equity, right, for the most marginalized communities. And we do have a commitment to redress harm, I think, and confront exclusionary and discriminatory practices that are on the books, right, in planning. And we also have to start to think about taking into account the changing demographics. The US is going to be a majority minority nation by 2015. So as we're in partnership with APA, I wanted to highlight some of their work around diversity and inclusion to sort of get a sense of the work that's been done. But there have been a number of divisions established with the APA. The first Women Planning Division in 1979, followed closely by Planning in the Black Community Division in 1980. We also have the LGBTQ and Planning Division, and there were also diversity forums starting to be established in 2008. One of the pivotal moments, I think, was the diversity and inclusion statement that was done in 2018. That was then sort of followed up by the equity policy guide. And these are sort of guiding directives from APA, both within their organization and also to guide their work outside of the organization. And the equity policy guide really focuses on equity-based recommendations for planners to use right within their work. They also have the ambassadors program, which is really more of a mentorship program with MAPS and really working with students as well and partnering them with mentors. There's also been substantial work out of the Latino division, Latinos in Planning division with a Changing America in 2019. And also more recently in 2019, the APA has now made mandatory these equity-related credits for AICP. And since COVID, there's been resources around planning in COVID-19, resource guides. And then last year in 2020, APA released a statement in response to George Floyd that reaffirmed its commitment to create great communities for all, with the goal of recognizing and eradicating the bad policy decisions of the past. And there also have been sort of the Equity and Planners video series. And as we talk about much of this work, we used a very broad definition of diversity that is inclusive, and is beyond race, ethnicity, and class, right, and gender. We looked across a number of different identities, but for the purposes of today, I'll be focusing specifically on race and ethnicity. So when we talk about sort of racial dynamics in planning, the representation of diverse groups still lags behind. African Americans and Latinx students, faculty, and practitioners, right, do not have the sort of the representation that's needed. Between 2008 and 2018, the percentage of Black and Latinx students increased from about 7% to 11% and 8% to 14%. But Black and Latinx students are underrepresented by about 50% compared to the overall population. We also see this at the university level. We have roughly 8% full-time Black faculty and 7.6% full-time Latinx faculty. And as we then look at the planning profession more broadly, it is predominantly white at 75%, with 8% Black practitioners and 7.7% Latinx practitioners. We also, as planners, have to really contend with, the negative historical context of planning, right? And this tension that exists between the relationships between the profession and communities of color, right? Planners still uphold the values of the most powerful groups and oftentimes discount marginalized communities, right? Whether it's through the community engagement process, right? Lack of being at the table for the decision-making process. And this, is something that planners certainly need to work on so that, sort of that local knowledge and communities are not always sort of left as an add-on, right, after projects are already sort of approved and adopted. With planning, we're also facing these entrenched legacies, right, of whiteness and white supremacy that is connected to property ownership. And with a number of exclusionary housing practices, right, whether it is redlining, restrictive covenants, right, and numerous factors that have gone into the work of planners, right, it limits our ability to really pursue, I think, equity and social just outcomes in the way that's needed, right? And so understanding the value of diversity and the policies and practices that can really redress harm and also prioritize equity are needed, as is more representation of people of color. So in terms of our study context, this work builds on our initial study of the climate for diversity of students that started in 2016. And we've partnered with APA and the APA Diversity Committee in 2017 to now study the climate for diversity for practitioners. And what we wanted to do is to identify where are some of those gaps that exist within the workplace, right? And to think about how can we provide more support for practitioners, right? And create these inclusive environments and better engage with diverse communities on the ground. And by identifying some of these knowledge gaps, right, I think APA, employers, and planning programs can start to better equip practitioners with some of the substantive knowledge and critical skills that are needed, right, to really, I think, successfully do the job of planners and what's required of us. And it's important as well. There are very few studies that have been done around the climate for diversity for students and also practitioners nationally. So understand how practitioners are experiencing social differences. What are their lived experience? And what are some of the needs of underrepresented groups? So in terms of some of our sort of high-level findings, we found that perceptions of personal bias and discrimination, right, is allocated differently based on your racial and ethnic identity. Something important to note is that respondents indicating that incidents of bias are occurring very often is relatively small. The more pronounced are specific questions, right, that are related to race, age, and citizenship status. So those are the ones that really stood out in terms of where bias is occurring very often. And so when taken together, this points to a need to better understand how workplaces actively can really support sort of healthy and inclusive climates for employees, and not only in the workplace, but in our public facing work, right? In the way that we also engage with communities on the ground. So our goal really has been to think about how to close that gap between education and practice. And the work, again, in the Student Climate Survey really has mirrored what we found with practitioners. So just to note that from students, we found bias and discrimination in planning education faced by students was focused on 4 areas. One was feeling alienated and having, right, that lack of representation and being quite isolated in their planning programs. Also feeling tokenized, right, and singled out. Students also discuss feeling hyper-visible, right? If you do something wrong as a student of color, right, it's clear, it's known, right? And the feeling that you must work twice as hard as your white colleagues to make it through the program. And then the last area is really the feelings of dismissal, right? That your lived experiences are not valued and not taken seriously in the classroom and are ultimately dismissed. So planning remains, sort of quite far behind. And there's a need not only for training, but attention to create a more inclusive field that promotes equity. And, I think about planning as being a calling, right? And we need to be ready to walk the walk, right? And not only talk the talk, and engage in how we can disrupt racist planning practices that continue to reproduce inequities in the workplace and also in the communities that we serve. So in terms of who we talked to, the first phase was a survey of practitioners. And we targeted APA members that were practicing either part or full-time. We received about 3,005 responses from that survey. And then our interview of participants, 308 survey participants volunteered to participate in an interview. Ultimately, we conducted about 104 interviews. And for this particular talk, I'm going to focus on the 12 African American and 12 Latinx participants that we interviewed. In terms of the geography of planners, we have the majority of respondents coming from the South and the West Coast, and to a lesser degree, the Midwest and Northeast. In terms of race and ethnicity for our survey, it's predominantly white, it's 75%, roughly 5% of Asian respondents, 8.2% African Americans, and 7.2% Hispanic or Latino. And we do acknowledge the limitation that there are not as many people of color in the APA database. So to sort of work through that, in the interviews of practitioners, we used a lot of snowball sampling to increase the number of people of color in our interviews. So we have about 13.5% Asian, African American around 11.5%, white being 48.1%, and Hispanic around 11.5%. In terms of gender, it was pretty even, at about 48% each, and then around 1% that identified as non-binary or third gender. In terms of nativity, 88% of our sample was born in the United States, and about 6% foreign-born naturalized citizens, and 4% other. In terms of the employment sectors, most of the people in the survey came from city planning, so about 42%. The second area was private consulting at 8%, and then working for a county or regional planning agency, respectively, at 14% and 8%. And in terms of position, it was pretty even, with about 30% across senior, mid-level, and junior level planners. So in terms of our findings, I'm going to kind of just talk about three specific areas. One being the perspectives on diversity in the workplace. So this is really around the bias, harassment, and discrimination based on identity that interviewees discussed. So I'll note tokenism and isolation, mistreatment, the questioning of qualifications, stereotyping, and bias in hiring and promotion. And then I'll also sort of tie back to the perspectives on professional education and preparation and some of the gaps in education that were pointed out by interviewees. And then I'll sort of wrap up with perspectives on efforts of professional organizations to incorporate diversity and inclusion initiatives into the workplace. So tokenism and isolation is something we heard from many interviewees. Tokenism is when a small number of people are used to give the appearance that a place is inclusive, right? Which ultimately results in isolation. African American and Latinx planners shared with us that they were always the only one, right? And treated as tokens. A few of the common statements were, I'm the only person of color at work. I've always been the Black planner, or I've always been the only Black female in the room, department, and internships in my career. An African American planner sort of talked about while being tokenized, she was also mistreated in the workplace. And she shared this experience about receiving a diversity award. And although her supervisor sent her to receive the award, she didn't believe her supervisor actually generally cared, right, about the racial and ethnic representation, but instead were using her as a symbol of token of diversity. And she says, in quote, it's also ironic because of the way I was treated in there. Accepting the award was kind of, yeah, it goes against each other, like they have respect for diversity and inclusion in the community, but not in the office. So I think this really sort of illustrates, right, that tokenism can be quite harmful, right? And it is something that happens more often than not and can be either implicit or explicit But in the end, right, it's quite harmful to the person that it's happening to within the workplace. In terms of mistreatment, negative treatment based on differences in race and identity were discussed. Some of our practitioners sort of described how they suffered mistreatment outside of the office, right, with officials and community members. So for instance, an African-American planner shared her story of bias and how she was treated differently in person compared to being on the phone. She talked about talking with the mayor on the phone, and when she showed up at City Hall, he looked at me and says, "You sound different than you look on the phone," right? So sort of the classic, you know, you talk white, right? But was disrespectful in the way of acknowledging, right, that she was in fact African-American. Another Black female notes that at a public event with public officials, her white colleagues of the city council members did not shake her hand. And she says, "I was discriminated against by the city council members, and they wouldn't shake my hand or take my business card, but they would take my coworkers. We were just standing in line, shaking hands, and they just skip over me." And so she attributed this sort of different treatment being more so to the deep-seated racism that exists in the Midwest, right? And another piece that we heard quite frequently was the questioning of qualifications. And this, you know, for me personally happens every day, all the time. But these are strong stereotypes about people of color, right? And you're considered less qualified, right? We're presumed to be incompetent rather than competent. So there are questions about, you know, educational qualification and how you got hired in your current position. A few of those questions that practitioners noted were, which planning school did you go to? Show me your portfolio. You know, what have you written before? Like, what's your experience? And several of our African-American and Latinx practitioners, you know, mentioned that they prefer to talk about their experiences, right, rather than the schools they attended, because many, you know, may have come from working class families or low income communities and may not have been to the top tier planning schools. Also noted by several practitioners is that people were either overtly surprised or suspicious when they learned about their positions, right? Which is, you know, a form of stereotyping. And a Black male planner explained after he was promoted to executive director that, you know, he's had many incidences of questioning my position, both academic level and the professional level. And I remember when I first got this position that I'm in now as an executive director, and I presented my business card to a municipal official that had just met me for the first time, that official's response was, "This couldn't possibly be your title." And so even though, right, sort of these things happen, right, one is that it really brings about these feelings of unworthiness, right, and being discouraged about these perceptions, right, sort of imposter syndrome, right, which we've certainly heard about, right, but these are forms of discrimination. Another aspect of bias and discrimination we heard from practitioners is that being profiled in the workplace as being aggressive was common. For instance, one African-American male sort of talked about, you know, the assumption that he should be prepared to deal with crime. And his boss told him that she wanted me to be in charge of safety. And I told her, I don't know anything about safety and security. And my boss simply told me, you are an African-American male. These drug dealers out there, African-American males, relate to you better. African-American planners also sort of acknowledged, right, that, you know, these things happen, but they don't share their grievances with their superiors, right? Because there's fear of retaliation and being punished, right? And this Black male also noted that, right, it's sort of just what comes with being Black male, I suppose. Another Latina planner sort of said, I've had moments where people have told me that I'm maybe too aggressive. And she believed that her directness, which she learned growing up in a large city, was misinterpreted as not polite in a smaller city, right? So this also, sort of victimizes, right, those from the oppressed group as well. And many planners explain that, they can't go to their organizations because not only will they be perceived as being angry, but it can potentially harm their career long term, right? And limit any possibilities of upward mobility. And the last point I think I want to highlight is bias in hiring and promotion. And this is an area that we found not only within African Americans and Latinx planners, but also among women, young women, also the LGBTQ community. So this was very prevalent in the hiring and promotion process, which led to compensation gaps and unfavorable treatment in promotions. And while some planners sort of talk about this as, okay, maybe it's unconscious, right? Others thought that it was more intentional bias in the hiring process and simply a lack of innovative approaches to recruit underrepresented groups. One thing that was sort of acknowledged, those that had been in the hiring process and witnessed it, said employers rely on the same institutions over and over again, right? And suggest that implicit or explicit biases in selecting applicants that meet, right, cultural norms, people you're comfortable with, right, or think would, work well in a white male working environment, or who ends up being selected. Practitioners also noted that the lack of women of color being promoted to leadership positions was rare. One African American woman, she talked about being the first woman of color promoted to a leadership role in her department. And as in the title of our paper, she said, I might at any given time be the odd duck that walks in the room. She also mentioned that we've never had any African American planners in the 17 years I've been in this company. We have an African American who does our IT here, but he's an outlier. So that's kind of where we are in our office. And it's very frustrating to me. I'm always racking my brain on how to reach out and try to build a more diverse workforce. And another Latino colleague talked about a colleague that was promoted because he was white. And said he got away with making $80,000 a year, and I'm not going to make that in the next 10 years. And I know that he got that job only because he was white. And so these perspectives come out, right? And African American Latinx planners express their displeasure in this process of not only being paid less than their white counterparts, but also, they've been there longer, they have more experience, and they continue to be constantly overlooked, right? And not promoted. And one piece that also was, I think, brought up across the board were the gaps that exist in educational preparation, particularly at being able to work in communities of difference and otherness. And something that, planning curriculum still kind of, has a gap in, right, is that we have these, broad goals and aims of equity, right, that we espouse in the classroom as a core value, but the implementation of equity in planning and policy decisions, right, whether it's at the local or county or regional level, you fail to see that, right? There's also a lack of depth in which many of these issues, right, around race and identity and culture are really embedded in planning curricula. It tends to be really an add-on to the class, or students have to go outside of the department to get this content. Something else that's been a challenge is sort of the lack of on-the-job training to improve community engagement practices when working in diverse communities. And oftentimes this may be a course like a studio capstone course where if it's community engaged, you would get that, sort of education, but many times you don't. And so you can leave a program without having done community engagement and without having actually engaged in these difficult conversations, right, around race, identity, and culture. And I think something that ties back into, the difficulty of where the workplaces are in the planning field is the limitation that came out in our survey of workplace initiatives that promote DEI. 66% of respondents indicated that their workplace did not regularly implement diversity or inclusion initiatives. Most initiatives sort of oriented around diversity or sexual harassment training. And again, even though the value of diversity may be acknowledged, oftentimes there are not the resources available, right, to really kind of follow through on implementing initiatives that supervisors or managers know would make a difference, right? They're unable to actually do so. The majority of planners also, said we need more trainings, right, on a range of topics from implicit bias, culturally sensitive practices, microaggressions, and how to accommodate differences in the planning process, and also working with, right, otherness on the ground. And a few respondents outwardly oppose diversity as it amounts to racial, sexual, ethnic favoritism, while marginalizing other groups such as low, middle class whites or reverse discrimination. And I think, again, as planning being a calling and knowing the history of planning and how it has marginalized communities of color, these sort of orientations, I think imply that maybe, this is not the right profession for those that espouse these ideas. So what are some of the implications that came out of this work? One is that the learning environment reproduces in professional settings between coworkers. Again, it's very consistent with our findings from the Student Climate Survey. And even though diverse representation is increasing, it's not enough. And so the office and workplace still remains unwelcoming to planners of color. Also, the discrimination and microaggressions that are faced by people of color in the workplace damage your confidence, your self-esteem, and make it difficult to have a sense of belonging, right? And where you're working and spending the majority of your time. And these implicit biases that occur prevent very capable and effective workers from achieving, right, upward mobility in terms of promotion. So, I think we need to move from diverse representation to inclusion. And workplaces that lack inclusive environments, whether it's, institutions or organizations or workplaces, will always struggle to not only attract, but to retain professionals of color, right? And the rationale for recruiting and retaining a more diverse workforce, has been that, the goal is to reflect the communities that planners are serving, particularly with the changing demographics. And so planning still has a long way to go where African Americans and Latinx planners are not only represented, right, but your lived experiences are validated, right, and are included in the workplace. So I'll just note a few recommendations, some high-level recommendations for employers, institutions, and students. We have sort of a vast range of recommendations in our report, which I'll talk a bit about at the end. But just a couple of highlights are to expand training opportunities for employers that are around diversity, anti-racism, cultural competency, implicit bias, microaggressions, and multicultural awareness, but not as one-offs, right? Trainings need to be done more as immersions that build on each other and are, potentially done quarterly, right? Because this is work that has to continually happen. Also developing strategic racial equity plans within organizations to really identify and then guide DEI strategies, right? To hold people accountable with measurable outcomes. And to sort of deal with the implicit and explicit biases in hiring, recruiting new planners from diverse institutions like HBCUs and HSIs, non-traditional sources and allied fields, with greater diversity to expand the applicant pool, because the broader the recruitment pool is, the less likely implicit biases, right, will sort of come to the surface. Also evaluating, right, promotion trends, right, and providing more opportunities for promotion of underrepresented groups in the workplace, particularly, right, in leadership positions. I think also committing to conducting racial impact assessments is really important to determine the types of planning decisions that are being made and their impacts on communities of color. And a quick shout out to the city of Chicago, who, recently implemented the first racial equity impact assessment on their LIHTC units in the country. So that's certainly a model to be followed. And also increasing the accessibility of planning expertise, right? Whether that's through community classrooms and workshops in partnership with local communities. And a quote I just wanted to sort of read is that a recommendation by a planner is that, I want to see a decolonization of planning knowledge. I want to see a decolonization of planning expertise, right? Because just because you don't have a master's degree, right, doesn't mean that locally embedded knowledge, right, is not useful. Those that live in the community are the actual experts, right, and should be, right, at the table sharing their planning expertise. And then we have a set of sort of recommendations for institutions. And one of those is elevating and amplifying the value of diversity, right, across planning departments, and really building those bridges between education and practice, whether it's through engaged curriculums, right, or strategic university community partnerships. Also institutionalizing more professional development outreach, right? Whether it's faculty and student or peer mentoring programs, right? Where you have onboarding and first-year students are matched with second-year students, right? To help move people through the program, right? And uncover some of those networks in the hidden curriculum. Also developing diversity strategic plans as guiding documents. We've done this in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at FSU, the first department to do so. We have the first college diversity plan getting ready to come out and be adopted as well. And this sets the tone, right, for the college and the departments around identifying and meeting diversity and inclusion goals, right? Again, holding people accountable, having metrics that can be measured, right, on a yearly basis to see if those goals are being met. And with those plans come, sort of concrete initiatives around recruiting and retaining underrepresented students and faculty, right? And creating space for our students' lived experiences again, whether that's through scholarships or postdoctoral appointments, startup packages, doing cluster hires or opportunity hires for faculty, right? Again, to not only recruit, but to retain a diverse sort of institution. And then I'll wrap up with sort of the integration of, again, diversity and cultural competency and social-based curriculum into the core classes, right? So that students, when they graduate, they've had it in the core, they've had this in their specializations, right? And they're prepared to go out into the workforce. Also requiring a suite of real-world participatory planning courses, right? So that students are effectively trained in community engagement techniques and build cultural competency and are prepared again for the workplace. So what are some recommendations for students? I think it's important, right, to always be seeking out training opportunities, not always informal or formal, sometimes they're informal, right? But really getting smart on various topics that as planners, right, we really do need to be aware of related to microaggressions, anti-racism, and multicultural awareness, for instance. Also institutionalizing affinity groups and professional development with mentor programs like APA has with MAPS and the Ambassador program. And then I think, right, advocating, always for explicit and anti-racist and decolonial curriculum, right? To work towards building a profession that's engaged in undoing its own institutionally embedded racism, sexism, ableism, and classism, right? And then at any time, right, whether it's in classes or outside the class, volunteering and doing service learning, attending community meetings, but really getting engaged in the communities around your university on the ground. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, this work comes out of a JAPA publication, Feeling Like an Odd Duck, the experiences of African American and Latino planning practitioners. And this work is part of a much larger report that will be coming out soon with the American Planning Association called Moving from Aspiration to Action and Reorienting Planners' Values Towards Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And very excited to talk about our JAPA special issue call that just came out today on anti-racist futures, disrupting racist planning practices in workplaces, institutions, and communities. So really hope to see many submissions from those on the call. So thank you. And are there any questions?
Much.
Before we go there, can we give a round of applause and snaps for that really motivating talk? That being said, okay, now get your questions.
Hit me with them.
You can type in into the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a student, if it's okay, I can start with the question.
Go for it, Nathan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I sometimes wonder, and this might be very hard to talk about, is, I mean, I'm Korean ethnically. I was born here in the US, but I spent most of my childhood in South Korea. And, it's a racially homogeneous country, but we have other sources of social tension, like what you said in your paper about people asking for your credential or looking down at you because you graduate from a less prestigious university. That's a huge source of social tension in Korea. And Korea has had millennia-long history of slavery and, classicism. We had a formal, caste system until the early, or class system until the early, I think early 20th century. I mean, this makes me wonder, like, you look at people and what's hard to accept, but what I sometimes think is, like it or not, there is some kind of perverse benefit in discrimination and creating different classes. And you can argue that's one of the key drivers on why so many different societies have had different forms of discrimination, whether it's race-based or class-based, income-based, or literally like college-based. I'm looking at a lot of these initiatives, and I'm wondering how effective they're gonna be unless, people actually have these difficult conversations that in some ways that being discriminatory is beneficial if you're in the dominant group.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my concern is that a lot of these programs sort of have a very top-down approach with a lot of assumptions. They just say, hey, this diversity is great, let's everybody just get on with the program. But I think a lot of these programs overlook these difficult conversations and historical factors that led to our system as it is. So, I mean, what you are.
Oh, you broke up, Nathan.
I think you did, but I think you can take it from there, April.
So sure. So I think, there's absolutely a benefit to white supremacy, right? That is sort of the historical context, at least in the United States, right? And I think the challenge that we have, within the academy, within the workplace, just within the orientation, is that you know, those dominant perspectives still rise to the top, right? And something that we are, you know, working on at FSU in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, right, is transformative change, right? So not only, right, bringing in, you know, a large group of faculty of color, right, but changing the curriculum, you know, sort of top to bottom, and making sure these issues of race identity and culture, and the negative histories, right, of planning and confronting those issues are spread across the curriculum. But what we are finding, right, is that it is very uncomfortable, and it breeds significant conflict, right, as you're pushing against, right, white supremacy. But, you know, I think it's necessary. I think we have to be uncomfortable with moving in this direction. And if we're going to confront, disrupt, and dismantle, you know, what's happening in the system, it's a necessary outcome. But what I do worry about is that it comes at the harm and the expense of our students of color, right? Who leave our programs incredibly traumatized, right? Because of what they've had to endure. You know, so that is something that tension that I'm still working through as well.
Anyone else?
April, I want to say thank you. And one of the things that I'm like really interested in is seeing how we tie kind of LGBTQ histories to racial equity movement that's happening now, so that we can hold, you know, really hold each other up and create more pressure on our organizations for change. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on organizations or cities or anyone where in your research you found like these folks are doing a better job of it. These are a good role model for us to learn from.
In terms of individuals, practitioners, organizations?
I was thinking I'd leave that open-ended, and if you said you should check out what these folks are doing because I like it because of this, maybe that would be somewhere I'd look.
Sure, sure. Of course, I'm at FSU, so I have to give, right, a shout out to Dr. Doan, who has just been doing incredible work around, you know, the LGBT community, and equality for all. And, you know, I've learned so much from her and her work, right? As well as from, you know, our students, right? Many of which, you know, are queer, and I'm learning every day some of the challenges that are faced. But I think that there is support, but there also needs to be, you know, I think at least solidarity, right, across all ethnic groups, all groups of otherness, and to not, I think, take opportunities, right? So sort of what we've seen in sort of that divisiveness or divisions that happen, right? Because we're all fighting white supremacy, right? That is the enemy. And I think if we can focus more on that, we can have more progress, you know, as opposed to aspiring, right, to be white adjacent, right, or to whiteness.
Anyone else? Go for it, Charisma. Unmute.
Thanks. It was saying you can't unmute yourself. I got to learn that Zoom feature. Thank you so much, April. This was a fantastic talk, very comprehensive. And I love the way you connected education to practice and the whole pipeline. And I was just talking with students the other day, you know, who are discouraged from going into the field of planning. And I've talked to practitioners who've talked about dubious practices when managers of color either were not promoted or removed from positions under very strange circumstances. So it's really bad out there, and discouraging when, like you said, we're trying to promote these values in the field. So one thing, so what I'm at Berkeley, and there's a lot of great resources, you know, that are provided to the faculty. One thing that the Office of Equity Inclusion shared for our searches are these articles showing the problems of diversity training. You know, it's a long-standing practice, right? In corporations and organizations and universities, you know, especially those terrible, you know, online trainings you got to do, and they're really to preempt lawsuits. And so I love that you had a suite of recommendations, but I was wondering if you could talk more about what is good training. And they talk about what training has to be paired with, you know, a whole range of complementary activities. Of course, there are limits on our time, on, you know, capacity, resources, the faculty who tend to be called on or who are interested in doing these things, you know. So just in terms of like the categories of recommendations are good, but just if you can shed some light on either like what are the key things to focus on when you're really trying to do the transformation like your department is doing. What is good training? We've also had well-intentioned bad training in our department that's made faculty dubious and not want to do anymore. So yeah, I just would love your thoughts on more of the qualities or characteristics of what works in those suite of recommendations. But and just awesome talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So yeah, so you know, I come out of UIC, right? So I came from a program that, you know, these are givens, right? These are things that are sort of in place to the Deep South, right? And it was a bit of a shock about sort of the culture and the norms and what's going on, right? And so, you know, we had to really, I think, have some very difficult conversations, right? And we have sort of, I'd say, dropped the hammer in a number of ways. So not only are there, you know, we do NCBI trainings, which is the National Coalition Building Institute. So we've done those as faculty and staff. We also have integrated into the orientation of our students. And then for capstone studio classes, you have to complete those cultural competency trainings. And so for us, these are not one-off trainings. They have cycles, right? And, you know, as you take one or two, right, like you continue to learn and grow. It's a process. It's a never-ending process, and you need to do it forever, right? Like it should never stop, you know? We also have some recommendations in the diversity plan with our Center for Teaching where, right, like support systems for being able to teach classes with this content, right? Because everyone is not comfortable doing it, but you know what? We all need to get comfortable doing it, right? It can't only fall on, you know, faculty of color. So that's another piece definitely that's coming in. There recently was an allyship group that was formed as well, right? And so that also now, right, is another forum for people that, right, want to support, want to help, right, can do that work, right? But not at the expense, right? Right, of the folks that, you know, are being taxed with a lot of, you know, taxation with that. So I think it's, you know, a several tiered approach. But again, it's difficult. We have had to implement codes of conduct, right? You know, and it's in your syllabi, right? It's in the orientation, you know? And it's difficult to sort of, I think, set those parameters, but it's even harder to have students of color come to you and say, I don't feel safe here, right? Are you going to protect me? And so that is what we have sort of started working through and had to get sign off from legal to do so, right? Like as a department, we couldn't even say we can protect you, you know? And that is certainly a disincentive, right, to stay in a department. So I think it's multi-layered, right? But I think it really starts with being able to have a critical mass of people that are on the same page. Because without a critical mass, so much just, you know, it falls by the wayside, right? And it's no longer really a priority. So I hope that kind of answers your question a bit.
It does. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Great. And I
Great.
see that Jane has her hand up, and I think this might be our last question. Go on.
How's that? Okay, that is exciting. Thank you, April, so much for this talk. And there's so much to think about here. And I think I'm following up a little bit from Charisma's comments. I'm in Iowa, right? I'm in Iowa State University. And so I'm very aware that our students of color, the field that we're sending them into, which is a vastly white field. And another issue that's come up from our students is that in our classes, race comes up, right? It doesn't happen in their chemistry classes. It doesn't happen in their math classes. And so, they've pushed us to think about, and I don't think that we're there yet, to preemptively assume that race will be, when we're going to talk about housing, right? They're going to, and it's not even because it's going to happen as, it should be happening as part of the conversation, but it's just also happening with the other people sitting next to them. And so there's these very multi-layered ways that students are encountering race and conversations about race. And so I don't know if I'm just kind of reflecting, I guess, and asking some of your comments. I really appreciate your push that we deeply embed this in our curriculum, these conversations. And I'm thinking part of how I teach is using team-based learning. So students are put into heterogeneous teams at the start of the semester. They stay in the same team the whole semester, and peer evaluation is part of their grade. And so we've realized, like, oh my goodness, what are we doing to our students? And so now we're having to train them on fairness, like how to learn how to evaluate each other well and fairly. So I think there's just so many, if we really start thinking about practice, like that's making better practitioners, period, right? But it also gets at the root of helping us address these issues that you're lifting up. So there's questions in there, but any thoughts or reflections you have continuing the conversation would be nice. Thank you.
Sure. So I think, again, reflecting, I'd say certainly the past few years where we have really had some conflict in our department. We've said, you know what? Our job is to train anti-racist planners, right? And if we are doing anything else, we have failed, right? And so that's the goal, and that comes again with a lot of curriculum changes, right? With our department, everyone has always been on board for that. Our other departments, not so much, right? Because it's a lift, it's a ton of work. But we also are actively recruiting students of color, right? And communities and students of otherness. And if we're going to do this and bring them to the Deep South, right, we better be ready and engaged to create the environment, I think, that keeps them safe to a degree, but also gives them the opportunity, right, to validate their experiences and bring that to the classroom, right? Because that knowledge is important, right? And right now, it largely gets left out of the curriculum and the discourse, right? And let's say, you're in community development, right? Where, most of the courses I teach, right, up front, right? This is what we're talking about. This is what we're doing. If you don't want to do it, I suggest you go take another class, right? But in core curriculum, right, it's a very different context, right? Some people don't want to be there, right? They're not engaged. And so we have to find more creative ways to integrate this material. But I think talking about it in the way of being a practitioner and what you're going to be up against, these are the skills you need. And this is what you need to be able to do to navigate now, right? Times have changed, right? And we do a lot of community engagement work. And again, our student population is predominantly white, right? And we got to get them ready, to go into Frenchtown or Providence, right? And you know, the residents are phenomenal. They're ready. They're like, come on, we're gonna help you along on this, right? You know, and we're gonna get through this together, you know? So it's also a learning experience, I think, with the communities we work with as well. And that openness, right? That students are still learning, but we don't want to have any planning malpractice happening.
Right.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So with that, can we get some snaps for April?
Thank you so much for having me. Great questions. And feel free to also reach out with other questions. Would love to have more dialogue.
And before you go, I would like to share my screen and make a plug for next week. Hey there, hi there, ho there. We're going to have Frank there.
Thank you, Daryl.
We're going to have Frank giving a talk on Mauer Park in Berlin. It was a partnership, I believe, with you and Gustav Lang. And you will do some sort of, not environmentalism, but evaluation of his designs there. Yes, no?
Yes.
All right, then.
Yeah.
Be there or be square.
Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, everybody.
Dr. Jackson. Thank you, Daryl. Great talk. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Glad to see you, April. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
All right, to my students, you got work to do.
Other people, I don't